Oh, I didn't realize the pool was reserved today.
I just needed a little break.
Let's keep our community welcoming for everyone.
The afternoon had started out picture perfect. The kind of slow summer day where the sun painted lazy streaks of gold across the neighborhood pool, and the only sound was the faint laughter of kids splashing in the shallow end. My wife, Emily, was 8 months pregnant, glowing in that way only expectant mothers can, and for once she'd agreed to let herself relax. She had been nervous about swimming. Something about being in a bathing suit at this stage made her feel self-conscious, but I'd coaxed her gently, promising that a little water therapy would soothe her aching back. She waddled to the edge of the pool, one hand on her belly, and eased herself in with a sigh of relief. For a few minutes, peace hung over the place like a warm blanket, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we could have one quiet afternoon without HOA nonsense. But that illusion shattered the moment Karen arrived. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA, didn't enter rooms so much as she stormed them. Her oversized sun hat cast a shadow that seemed to demand attention. Her designer sunglasses flashed like warning beacons, and her voice carried across the pool deck before her heels even clicked against the pavement. She wasn't alone, either. Two of her usual sycophants trailed behind her like ducklings, clutching their towels and whispering. Karen had a long history of nitpicking everyone's lives. Lawn edging too uneven, trash cans visible from the street for 5 minutes too long, Christmas lights removed one day late. And yet today, she seemed especially on the hunt for someone to belittle. She spotted Emily in the pool, and I watched her lips curl into that smirk I'd come to recognize, the one that meant she was about to humiliate someone just to flex her authority. It wasn't enough for her to quietly judge. She needed an audience. She strutted closer, deliberately loud, so every sunbather and swimmer could hear, and unleashed her venom, mocking Emily's swollen belly, making snide comments about how some people treated the community pool like their private spa, and even cracking a joke about her swimsuit choice. I could see Emily's face crumble, a mixture of hurt and humiliation flooding her eyes, and something inside me tightened like a coiled spring. The laughter of a couple of onlookers, nervous, unsure, but still there, echoed like nails on a chalkboard. In that moment, I felt every ounce of anger and protectiveness boil up inside me, but I didn't lash out. Not yet. I knew Karen thrived on provoking people into outbursts so she could paint herself as the victim later. Instead, I took Emily's hand, whispered reassurance, and guided her toward a lounge chair. Still, my mind was already churning. Karen had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and the sting of her cruelty would linger long after the chlorine smell faded from our skin. I glanced at the neighbors. Some avoided eye contact. Others gave small sympathetic looks, but stayed silent. It was the same old pattern. Karen intimidates. Everyone else stays quiet. But what none of them knew, and what Karen herself had clearly forgotten, was that today, of all days, her boss was scheduled to make an appearance. The timing was almost poetic. The state's governor, a man known for visiting local communities unannounced to check on neighborhood initiatives, was Karen's actual employer. She worked as his public relations manager, a fact she flaunted every chance she got. She'd bragged about it at countless HOA meetings, dropping his name like a royal seal of approval. What she didn't realize was that her little kingdom of chlorine and pool chairs was about to become the stage for her own undoing as the heat pressed down. I could feel the tension building like thunderheads on the horizon. Emily sipped water quietly, pretending not to care, but I knew the tears were threatening just behind her brave face. My mind raced, not with thoughts of revenge, but with a growing sense that justice was on its way without me lifting a finger. Across the pool deck, Karen basked in her self-satisfaction, laughing too loudly with her friends, completely unaware that her smugness was about to crumble. She had mocked a pregnant woman in public, and fate, with impeccable timing, was already setting the pieces in motion for her humiliation. The kids kept splashing, oblivious, while a couple of older neighbors whispered behind their hands. The air felt heavier, charged with the kind of anticipation you can't quite name but can feel in your bones. I leaned back in my chair, my hand resting on Emily's, and allowed myself a small, silent smile. Karen thought she was untouchable, the queen bee of our little lakeside community. But in less than 10 minutes, the universe was going to prove her wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The minutes after Karen's cruel performance seemed to stretch longer than they really were, each second carrying the weight of suppressed outrage and silent witnesses. Emily sat quietly, pretending to focus on the movement of water across the pool's surface, but I could see her fingers knotting the towel in her lap and the subtle tremble in her shoulders. My own heartbeat thudded like distant drums, a mixture of anger and anticipation, but I forced myself to stay outwardly calm. Around us, the atmosphere shifted. The mothers at the shallow end began avoiding Karen's gaze, their laughter dying into awkward whispers. A father gathering his kids gave me a quick sympathetic nod before herding his children away. It was clear that Karen's behavior had made more than a few people uncomfortable, but years of living under her petty rule had taught them to remain spectators. What Karen did not know was that the governor's visit wasn't just a courtesy drop by. He was here to evaluate the very community programs she had been boasting about. The same programs she had neglected while wasting energy on trivial power trips like this. Karen moved about the pool deck like a cat convinced of its dominance, adjusting her sunglasses and issuing minor commands to her followers. She nitpicked a lifeguard's umbrella placement, criticized the choice of snack bar music, and even scolded a teenager for dripping water on the pavement. Each action seemed calculated to reinforce her illusion of authority. Emily's breathing steadied beside me, but her silence was heavy, the kind of quiet that speaks of humiliation buried under composure. I kept my eyes on Karen, studying her like a hawk studies its prey, and thought of the irony that was about to unfold. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a black SUV would already be winding its way toward the community center, carrying the man whose opinion could shape her future. She had no inkling of how close her carefully curated facade was to crumbling that I thought back on the months we had endured her antics. The time she fined an elderly neighbor for planting sunflowers too close to the walkway, or when she berated a single mom over a slightly faded welcome mat. Karen thrived on creating moments where others felt small. Today she had chosen my pregnant wife as her target, and that choice would prove disastrous. The breeze stirred faint ripples across the pool, a subtle shift that mirrored the undercurrent of change about to sweep through this place. The air felt different now, heavier with the promise of accountability. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath. The afternoon sun paused in its descent as if it, too, was waiting for the inevitable collision of arrogance and justice. Emily reached for her water bottle, her hand still trembling slightly. I brushed her knuckles with my fingers, a silent gesture of comfort, but I could feel her shame like a physical weight between us. She was the strongest person I knew, someone who had weathered morning sickness, swollen ankles, and the anxieties of first-time parenthood with grace. But cruelty cuts deepest when it's delivered publicly, and Karen had ensured an audience. I scanned the faces around the pool. Some neighbors watched Karen with thinly veiled resentment. Others avoided looking at her at all, but none dared to speak. That was the power Karen had cultivated, an atmosphere where compliance felt safer than confrontation. But power built on fear is brittle, and the crack in her armor was forming that a few more minutes ticked by, each one thick with unspoken tension. Karen, oblivious, pulled out her phone to snap a photo of a flower arrangement by the pool gate, probably planning to critique it later in the HOA newsletter. Her friends laughed at some snide remark she made, their voices forced and shallow. Across the parking lot, the faint hum of an approaching vehicle reached my ears. I turned my head slightly, just in time to catch the glint of sunlight on polished black paint. My pulse quickened. The governor's SUV slowed as it approached the entrance, its presence commanding quiet awe from the few who noticed. A couple of kids stopped splashing, sensing something important was happening even if they didn't understand why. Karen was still too absorbed in her own performance to notice. She adjusted her hat, checked her reflection in her phone screen, and gestured dramatically toward the snack bar worker as if delivering royal orders. The sound of the SUV door closing echoed across the pool area, a sharp clap that cut through the murmurs. Heads turned, whispers began to spread, and for the first time all afternoon, Karen hesitated. She glanced toward the entrance, irritation flickering across her features at the interruption. But when she recognized the tall, distinguished figure stepping onto the pool deck, her expression shifted in an instant. The governor's arrival was not part of her script for the day. The governor was a man of quiet authority, the kind who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His tailored suit jacket was casual enough for the summer heat, but his presence carried the weight of leadership. He scanned the area with a measured gaze, his eyes briefly landing on Emily, then on Karen, then on the small cluster of neighbors pretending to be nonchalant. The pool seemed to fall into a collective hush, the laughter of children replaced by the sound of water lapping against the tiles. Karen straightened her shoulders and smoothed her hair, the confidence in her posture faltering for just a heartbeat before she pasted on a smile that I could almost taste the shift in the air, the way a storm announces itself with a subtle drop in pressure before the first crack of thunder. Karen had spent years ruling this neighborhood like a petty monarch, convinced of her invulnerability. And now the highest authority in the state stood just yards away, watching, evaluating, and unknowingly carrying the potential to expose her hypocrisy. Emily's grip on my hand tightened ever so slightly, her eyes wide with a flicker of surprise and cautious hope. The stage was set, the players in position, and the perfect storm was gathering over the tranquil blue water. The next few minutes would decide whether Karen's empire of intimidation would endure or collapse, and though I hadn't planned revenge, I realized that sometimes justice doesn't need planning. It simply arrives uninvited. At the perfect moment, the governor's presence transformed the pool area into a stage where every small movement suddenly felt significant. Every whisper seemed amplified, and every misstep threatened to echo louder than intended. Karen, who moments ago had wielded her petty authority like a weapon, now shifted uneasily on her heels, her usual swagger tempered by the awareness that the man whose opinion mattered most in her professional life was watching. The children resumed their quiet splashing, but the tone of their play had softened, as though even they sensed an invisible boundary had been crossed. Emily sat a little straighter beside me, her earlier humiliation still raw but now interwoven with a quiet, fragile anticipation that maybe the tide was about to turn. I could feel her fingers tighten around mine again, the smallest tremor of nervous energy coursing through her touch. Around us, neighbors who had been silent witnesses for years began to exchange wary glances, their eyes darting between Karen's forced composure and the governor's calm, assessing gaze. The pool deck, once just a place of leisure, had become the arena for a reckoning. Karen attempted to reassert control through small, meaningless tasks, straightening a poolside chair and pretending to check her phone as though she were coordinating some grand plan. But the cracks in her facade were visible to anyone paying attention. The slightly too quick movements, the way her lips pressed into a thin line when she thought no one was looking. Her reputation had been carefully constructed on the illusion of perfection and control, and yet that illusion was fragile, dependent on a community's fear and the absence of scrutiny from those with real power. Today, both were slipping from her grasp. The governor moved slowly, methodically, greeting a few stunned neighbors and casting his gaze over the facilities. His steps seemed almost ceremonial, each one reminding Karen of the hierarchy she had forgotten she belonged to. The irony that she had spent so long flaunting her professional connection to him, while neglecting the very standards she was supposed to uphold, was delicious in its inevitability that I watched her closely, noting every flicker of unease. Karen had chosen to humiliate Emily not because there was any genuine concern about pool rules or community decorum, but because she had needed to remind everyone of her dominance. But dominance built on cruelty corrodes from within. As the governor continued his quiet survey, Karen's forced laughter rang hollow against the tranquil sounds of the afternoon. Her two sycophants stood off to the side, exchanging nervous whispers, suddenly unsure whether their loyalty was an asset or a liability. Even the lifeguard, who had endured countless lectures from Karen over the summer, watched her now with a trace of satisfaction hidden behind his professional mask. The sun slid lower, casting long shadows across the shimmering water, and the air seemed to hold its breath. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the late pregnancy making prolonged sitting difficult, but her eyes never left the unfolding scene. I felt a surge of protective pride for her. She had endured Karen's ridicule with grace, even as the wound still throbbed beneath the surface. The community had seen her strength, seen Karen's malice, and now, whether or not the governor ever knew the exact details of what had been said, The truth of Karen's character hung in the air like a bitter scent. Karen's arrogance had always been her shield, but now it had become her trap. As the governor paused near the snack bar, murmured questions floated between the neighbors who lingered nearby. It was clear that his unannounced visit was not just a social call. He was inspecting the neighborhood programs Karen had been entrusted to oversee, the very programs she had neglected in favor of her obsessive micromanagement of trivial rules. She had boasted for months about how her leadership kept the community pristine, how her connections at the state level ensured funding and attention, how her standards maintained the neighborhood's reputation. But what people had actually experienced was her belittling their choices, imposing arbitrary fines, and humiliating those who dared to step outside her narrow definition of acceptability. The tension deepened with every passing moment. Karen's smirk had faded entirely now, replaced by a brittle mask of cordiality that fooled no one. The governor's deliberate pace and his occasional pauses to speak quietly with residents made it clear he was observing far more than surface appearances. I could sense the neighbors beginning to awaken from their collective silence, their glances at one another growing bolder, their whispers just a little louder. Power, when revealed as fragile, loses its grip with astonishing speed. Karen, once the unchallenged queen of our community, now looked less like a ruler and more like a cornered pretender clinging to her tattered crown. Emily exhaled slowly, the sound mingling with the gentle lapping of the pool water, and I knew she too sensed that a change was coming. My anger had cooled into something steadier now, a quiet certainty that Karen's cruelty would not go unanswered. There was no need for theatrics or confrontation on my part. The universe had conspired to bring her boss here at the perfect moment. And as the first murmurs of discontent among the residents grew into small, hesitant conversations, I could see the foundations of Karen's influence beginning to crumble. Her friends no longer looked at her with blind admiration, but with the wary calculation of people who had chosen the wrong side. The air, thick with heat and chlorine, now carried a different charge, a whisper of justice and the first faint notes of freedom. In that moment, as the governor turned and began walking toward the section of the pool where Karen lingered, the fragile hierarchy she had enforced for years began to collapse in silence. The stage was set for the final blow, and everyone present could feel it, even if they didn't yet know how completely the next few minutes would change everything. The water shimmered under the lowering sun, the shadows stretched long, and the smallest ripples on the surface hinted at a storm about to break. Karen's world, built on intimidation and vanity, was seconds away from unraveling, and the entire neighborhood was about to witness her fall from grace. The governor's measured steps carried him toward the heart of the pool deck, the murmurs of the gathered neighbors fading into an almost reverent hush as anticipation reached its peak. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, gilding the scene in warm amber light and casting long shadows that stretched across the concrete like stage curtains preparing to close. Karen stood stiffly, her forced smile trembling at the edges, the weight of countless small cruelties now pressing down on her, as if the air itself had turned heavy. The moment had the charged stillness of a thunderstorm poised to break, a sense that something inevitable was about to happen, and that everyone present would remember it long after the sunburns and chlorine faded. The governor stopped near the lifeguard stand, surveying the facilities with quiet scrutiny, his gaze sweeping past the sparkling water, the immaculate hedges, and finally landing on Karen. She straightened reflexively, lifting her chin a fraction too high, a gesture meant to project confidence, but instead betraying her desperation. Around her, the neighbors watched silently, the first stirrings of long-suppressed resentment flickering in their eyes. Years of being fined, mocked, and intimidated had built up like invisible sediment. And now, under the gaze of true authority, that sediment was shifting, ready to avalanche. Emily adjusted her position in her chair, wincing slightly as she shifted her pregnant belly. But her face held a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to Karen's brittle bravado. She was the unspoken heart of this moment, the woman who had endured public ridicule with grace, the symbol of the community's shared frustration, and the proof of Karen's callousness. As I watched, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and humility. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about balance being restored, about a bully's power evaporating in the light of scrutiny. The governor, oblivious to the specifics of what had transpired only minutes earlier, nevertheless seemed attuned to the undercurrents around him. He spoke briefly with a couple of residents, their hushed words and subtle gestures painting a picture of the discontent that had simmered under Karen's reign. Each quiet exchange was another thread unraveling from the fabric of her authority. Karen attempted to maintain her image, gesturing toward the landscaping and the freshly painted signs as though presenting evidence of her supposed stewardship. But the nervous energy in her movements betrayed her, and the governor's polite nods carried no warmth. He continued his tour, stopping at the bulletin board that listed community events, many of which had been canceled or poorly managed under Karen's watch, while she busied herself issuing petty violations. The silence among the residents grew heavier, no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of witnesses waiting for the inevitable fall. The irony was almost poetic. The very boss whose name she had flaunted to elevate herself above her neighbors was now silently dismantling the illusion of her power simply by existing in the same space and observing the reality she had neglected. The governor prepared to leave. The shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere became palpable. The spell Karen had cast for years, this collective belief that her whims were law, had broken. Neighbors who once averted their eyes now exchanged knowing looks, small smirks, or subtle nods of encouragement toward Emily and me. The two sycophants who had trailed Karen earlier quietly stepped back from her side, their allegiance dissolving as swiftly as it had been declared. Karen herself seemed to shrink, her sun hat suddenly too large for her bowed head, her shoulders rounded as if the weight of her pretense had become unbearable. The governor's SUV door shut with a muted finality, and as the vehicle rolled away, the sound was like a gavel marking the end of her reign in the hours and days that followed. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. What had happened at the pool became the whispered legend of our community, retold with a mixture of glee and disbelief. People who had been silent for years began sharing their own stories of Karen's tyranny, of ridiculous fines for harmless decorations, of nasty comments made under the guise of maintaining standards, of friendships strained under the weight of her interference. Empowered by the governor's unintentional intervention and the collective realization that Karen was not untouchable, the neighbors acted. At the next HOA meeting, attendance was record-breaking. Voices once timid spoke with confidence. Proposals for fairness and transparency were met with applause instead of fear. And when a motion for a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership was raised, it passed with overwhelming support. She was removed as president in less time than it took for the coffee to cool on the refreshment table. Karen's downfall was not accompanied by shouting or gloating. It was quiet, decisive, and absolute. Without her title, and without the illusion of her connection to power, she was just another neighbor now, one whose past behavior had left her isolated. She still attended a few meetings, sitting near the back, but the sharpness had drained from her presence. The clipboard she had once carried like a scepter was conspicuously absent, and the smugness had been replaced by a wary caution. For Emily and me, life returned to a peaceful rhythm. We walked to the pool without dread, chatted with neighbors who now greeted us warmly, and prepared for the arrival of our baby with hearts a little lighter. One late afternoon. Weeks later, I sat with Emily on a bench overlooking the water, the sound of children playing mingling with the chirping of crickets. The memory of that tense day at the pool had softened into something almost bittersweet, a reminder of how fragile power can be and how quickly arrogance collapses when confronted by truth. The community was different now, friendlier, freer, more united. Emily rested her head on my shoulder, her hand cradling her belly, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing we had weathered the storm without ever lowering ourselves to Karen's level. The lesson was clear and enduring. Bullies thrive only when silence shields them. But even the smallest act of exposure, like a boss walking in at the right moment, can topple a throne built on fear. The pool, once a stage for humiliation, had become a place of laughter again, and the neighborhood had learned something vital about standing together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, I thought of the day Karen mocked my pregnant wife and how, in the end, she had undone herself. Justice had not arrived with anger or noise. It had walked in quietly. 10 minutes later, wearing a governor's suit and a knowing gaze.